They had already sold my ranch to investors. I thought buying an abandoned 720-acre Wyoming ranch would be simple. No neighbors, no HOA, no problems. Then I arrived and found a brand new iron gate locked across my own entrance. Standing beside it was an HOA president holding paperwork claiming my ranch belonged to her community and that I owed 6 figures in fees. The strange part wasn't the threat. It was how desperately they wanted land nobody else seemed to want. What I uncovered next led to hidden documents, secret development plans, a courtroom full of shocked investors, and one deed nobody bothered to read until it was too late. And before we get into it, if you enjoy stories about standing your ground, protecting what's yours, and watching the truth catch up with people who think they're above it, take a second to subscribe.
It's right here.
Now let me show you why an HOA spent years acting like they owned my ranch, until their own lawyers read the deed. The first thing I saw was the gate, not the ranch, not the old windmill I remembered from the auction photos, not the miles of grassland stretching across 720 acres of Wyoming prairie. The gate, black iron, fresh paint, heavy enough to stop a truck, and bolted to the center was a bright white sign that read, Cedar Ridge Estates Private Community Property Unauthorized Entry Prohibited. Sat in my pickup for several seconds staring at it. Then I checked the address on the purchase documents lying on the passenger seat. Same property, same parcel number, same ranch I'd legally bought 3 weeks earlier through a county auction. The same ranch that had sat abandoned for almost 14 years. The same ranch nobody seemed interested in until the moment I became the owner. I shut off the engine and stepped out. The afternoon was quiet except for the sound of metal tapping somewhere beyond the fence. Construction. That caught my attention immediately. There wasn't supposed to be anybody out here. The county records described the property as abandoned. No active structures, no utilities, no occupants. Yet somebody was working behind my gate. My gate. I walked closer. The chain around the entrance was new. The lock was new. Even the gravel leading up to the gate showed fresh tire tracks. I crouched down and touched one of them. Less than a day old. A vehicle had entered recently. Several vehicles, actually. I was still studying the tracks when a voice called out behind me. "Can I help you?" I stood and turned. A white SUV had rolled up without me hearing it. A woman stepped out. Mid-50s, blonde hair, expensive sunglasses, pressed white blouse. The kind of person who looked completely out of place standing beside an abandoned ranch. She walked toward me with the confidence of somebody approaching her own property. "You're Grant Mercer." It wasn't a question. I nodded once. "And you are?" She smiled. Not warmly. The way people smile when they're delivering bad news they've rehearsed. Diane Whitlock, president of Cedar Ridge Estates. The name meant nothing to me, at least not yet. She extended a folder toward me. "I was hoping we'd speak before you drove all the way out here." I didn't take the folder. Instead, I glanced toward the hills behind her. Rows of expensive homes sat beyond the ridgeline. New construction, stone entrances, decorative fencing, a private community. That had to be Cedar Ridge. It was at least half a mile away from my ranch. Maybe more. "What does your neighborhood have to do with my property?" I asked. Her smile widened slightly. "That's actually why I'm here." She opened the folder herself. Several pages, maps, notices, printed forms. Everything looked official at first glance. "Unfortunately," she said, "the property you purchased falls under Cedar Ridge jurisdiction." I looked at her, then at the gate, then back at her. "No. I'm afraid it does." "No," I repeated calmly. "It doesn't." She didn't seem offended, just patient, like she'd already expected resistance. The previous owner entered agreements years ago. There hasn't been an owner living here for more than a decade. The agreements remain attached to the property. I finally accepted the folder and flipped through it. Community assessment notices, architectural compliance requirements, road maintenance fees, HOA bylaws. Then I saw the number. $184,320. Outstanding assessments. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Diane's expression hardened. You find that amusing? I find it impossible. Her eyes narrowed. The debt accumulated over several years. There wasn't anybody here to pay it. That doesn't eliminate the obligation. I closed the folder. I bought an abandoned ranch at a county auction. Correct. It isn't inside your subdivision. It is now. I stared at her. That answer bothered me more than everything else she'd said. Not because it made sense, because it sounded rehearsed. Like she'd been waiting for this conversation. Like she'd already convinced herself the outcome was inevitable. I looked past her again toward Cedar Ridge. The houses, the roads, the construction equipment moving in the distance. Money. A lot of money. Which made one question impossible to ignore. Why did they care about 720 abandoned acres? The ranch wasn't particularly valuable. No lake, no resort, no active cattle operation, no major improvements. Just land. A lot of empty land. Yet here stood an HOA president demanding nearly $200,000 before I'd even unlocked the gate. That wasn't normal, and people rarely spend this much effort on something worthless. You've put a gate on my property, I said. She shrugged. The community had to protect itself. From what? Uncertainty. That answer made even less sense. I stepped closer to the sign. The bolts were still shiny, recently installed, probably within the last few weeks, maybe days. The timing wasn't accidental. Somebody had moved very quickly after the auction. You put this here after the sale. Again, no denial, only that same controlled smile. We took necessary precautions. Necessary. Interesting word. I spent 22 years working county infrastructure projects, road easements, boundary disputes, utility corridors. I've learned something about people who use words like necessary. They're usually trying to justify something they know they shouldn't be doing. I handed the folder back. I'll be keeping copies. Of course. And I'll be removing the gate. For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed her face. That would be unwise. Why? Because litigation becomes expensive very quickly. There it was. Not a warning. A threat. Polite. Professional. But a threat all the same. I looked at the gate again, then at the ranch beyond it, then back at Diane. I didn't argue. People like Diane expected arguments. They prepared for them. What they rarely prepared for was silence. So I simply nodded, turned around, and walked back toward my truck. Mr. Mercer. I stopped. What? There was something almost amused in her voice now. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You really should have spoken to us before bidding. Slowly, I turned around. The folder was tucked beneath her arm. The wind moved through the grass between us. What does that mean? For the first time during our entire conversation, Diane looked genuinely surprised. Not because I'd asked, because I didn't already know. Then she recovered, instantly. The smile returned. Oh, nothing. I waited. She held my gaze. Then she added, let's just say everyone expected the auction to go differently. My stomach tightened. County ownership records weren't public yet. That process usually took several more days, sometimes weeks, which meant there was only one way Diane could have known about the sale. She'd been watching it, or someone had been watching it for her. And suddenly, the question that had bothered me since arriving became much larger. This wasn't about HOA dues, it wasn't about compliance notices, and it definitely wasn't about an abandoned ranch nobody wanted. Because somebody had wanted it badly enough to monitor the auction before ownership became public. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and looked once more at the locked gate blocking my land. As Diane walked back toward her SUV, only one thought remained. Why was Cedar Ridge so afraid of me owning this ranch? And what exactly had I just bought? Those two questions stayed with me the entire drive into town. I stopped at the county recorder's office before I even unloaded a single box from my truck. If Diane Whitlock wanted a fight, I wanted facts first. The clerk behind the counter recognized the parcel number immediately. That surprised me. "You're the new owner?" she asked. I nodded. She hesitated for half a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she disappeared into the back room and returned with the file. The ranch records filled an entire archive folder. Tax records, boundary surveys, old plats, transfer notices. Nothing unusual, at least not at first. I spent nearly 2 hours reviewing everything. The ranch remained exactly what I thought it was. Independent, unincorporated, outside Cedar Ridge Estates. No HOA annexation. No recorded merger. No covenant transfer. Nothing. Legally, the property stood alone, which meant Diane's claims weren't merely mistaken. They were impossible. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me uneasy. Because people don't fabricate six-figure claims unless they believe something important is at stake. I left the courthouse carrying certified copies of every document connected to the ranch. When I returned to the property, Diane was waiting. This time she wasn't alone. A silver luxury sedan sat beside her SUV. A tall man in a navy suit stood next to it holding a leather briefcase. He looked exactly like the kind of attorney who billed by the quarter hour. Diane smiled when she saw my truck, almost as if she'd expected me. "Mr. Mercer." I climbed out slowly. The attorney stepped forward. "Randall Pierce." He offered his hand. I ignored it. "Can I help you?" "We're here to avoid unnecessary litigation." People who say that are usually preparing litigation. Randall opened his briefcase and produced a thick stack of papers. Maps, legal notices, property diagrams, all professionally printed, far more sophisticated than the folder Diane had shown me earlier. "We've prepared documentation demonstrating Cedar Ridge's jurisdiction over the ranch." He handed me the stack. I started reading immediately. The first map showed my ranch highlighted in blue. According to the document, the property had supposedly been incorporated into Cedar Ridge nearly 8 years earlier. Interesting. Because the county file I'd reviewed that morning showed no such filing. The second page was worse. An amended boundary map, official seal, survey references, recorded parcel numbers. Everything looked convincing. Until I reached the footer. Then I smiled. "What?" Randall didn't like that smile. "The parcel number is wrong." His expression didn't change. "The map is accurate." "No." I pointed to the page. "This parcel number belongs to a grazing lease 20 miles north of here." Silence. A brief one, but I noticed it. I flipped another page, then another. The mistakes kept coming. Incorrect survey references, expired municipal codes, boundary descriptions that didn't match the county plats. One page even referenced a road that hadn't existed in over a decade. Someone had spent serious money creating these documents, but whoever built them hadn't expected the property owner to understand infrastructure records. Diane's patience started to crack. "You're missing the larger point." "No." I closed the packet. "I think I'm finding it." Her jaw tightened. Randall stepped in before she could respond. "The community has operated under these assumptions for years." That sentence caught my attention. Assumptions, not ownership, not rights. Assumptions. Interesting choice of words. I looked directly at him. "Did you personally verify these filings?" His eyes narrowed. "We are confident in our position." That wasn't an answer, which meant he probably knew it, or suspected it. Diane stepped closer. "The community has invested millions based on these boundaries." There it was. Not ownership, not law, money. Something about this ranch mattered financially. A lot. More than they wanted to admit. I loaded the documents into my truck. "I'll be keeping these." Randall immediately objected. "Those are working copies." "I know." I smiled. "And now they're mine." For the first time, Diane looked genuinely angry. Not theatrical anger, real anger. The kind people show when something stops going according to plan. They left 10 minutes later. The moment their vehicles disappeared down the road, I opened a storage box in my truck and pulled out a black 3-ring binder. I printed a label. Cedar Ridge Claims. Every document went inside. Every map, every notice, every letter. People lie. Paper remembers. By sunset, the binder already held more than 50 pages. I was organizing them on the tailgate when another truck pulled onto the county road. Old Ford. Faded green paint. Livestock rack in the back. The driver was probably in his late 60s. Weathered face, ranch hands. He stopped beside the fence and rolled down his window. "You Grant Mercer?" "Depends who's asking." The old man laughed. "Tom Grayson." The name meant nothing to me. Yet. He pointed toward Cedar Ridge. "You should be careful with those people." I closed the binder. "Why?" His smile disappeared. "Because now he wasn't joking. Because you're not the first owner they've gone after." I stared at him. Tom looked toward the distant rooftops of Cedar Ridge, then back at me. 3 different owners challenged them over the years. What happened? Another pause. Longer this time. Finally he said, "They all sold." I waited. Tom shook his head. "No one around here ever figured out why." Then he drove away. I stood alone beside my truck as darkness settled over the ranch. The binder sat open on the tailgate. The fake maps, the forged notices, the wrong parcel numbers. None of it made sense. Until a single thought occurred to me. What if Diane wasn't trying to convince me? What if she was trying to scare me into leaving before I discovered whatever the previous owners had found? As that possibility settled into my mind, I looked out across 720 acres of abandoned land. And for the first time since buying the ranch, I wondered whether someone had been waiting years for this property to stay abandoned. The next morning, I cut the chain off the gate. Legally, it wasn't a difficult decision. The gate sat on my property. The county records confirmed it. The deed confirmed it. The lock disappeared into the bed of my truck. I drove through and spent the day inspecting the ranch for the first time. What I found raised more questions than answers. The main house was weathered but structurally sound. The barn needed work. Several cattle fences had collapsed. None of that surprised me. What surprised me were the survey stakes. Bright orange markers stood in several locations across the property. New markers. Not old. Not forgotten. Fresh. Some still had paint on them. I pulled one from the ground and examined it. No survey company name. No permit reference. Nothing. Just a stake. By noon, I had found 12 of them, all positioned along a line running toward Cedar Ridge Estates. That wasn't random. Someone had been measuring something, and they hadn't asked permission. I photographed every stake before removing it. The photos went into the binder. The stakes went into the barn. Evidence first, questions later. 2 days after that, I noticed the first contractor, a white pickup parked on a ridge overlooking the ranch. The driver sat there for nearly an hour, watching. When I started driving toward him, he left. The following day, another truck appeared. Different vehicle, same location, same behavior, watching. By the end of the week, I had photographs of 4 different vehicles doing the exact same thing. None belonged to ranchers. None belonged to utility companies. All of them were connected to Cedar Ridge. The pressure was becoming visible, and they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Then the photographs started. I was repairing an old fence line when I noticed movement across the property line. A man holding a camera. Expensive lens, professional equipment. He photographed my barn, the pasture, the fences, the house. Then he photographed me. I raised a hand. He immediately turned and walked away. That evening, I added a new section to the binder. Surveillance. The next morning, something even stranger happened. A family from Cedar Ridge drove directly onto one of my ranch roads. Not accidentally, deliberately. They treated it like a community access road. I stopped them before they reached the western pasture. The driver rolled down his window. "Is there a problem?" I stared at him. "You're on private property." He looked genuinely confused. "No, we're not." "Yes, you are." He pointed behind him. "The HOA map says this road belongs to Cedar Ridge." That sentence bothered me. Not because he was lying, because he believed it. Someone had been telling residents this ranch already belonged to the community. The man apologized and left. But the damage was done. The HOA wasn't just making claims. They were creating a narrative. One resident at a time. 3 days later, Tom Grayson returned. This time he brought coffee and answers. We sat on the tailgate of my truck overlooking the southern pasture. Tom watched workers moving around Cedar Ridge's newest construction site. They've been buying land for years. I looked at him. "Who has?" "Cedar Ridge." "How much?" Tom laughed without humor. "Everything they can get." That got my attention. He pointed toward the eastern hills. Used to be 4 ranches over there. Then he pointed west. 3 more over there. Every direction he pointed had the same story. Bought, developed, absorbed, expanded. Cedar Ridge had been growing for years, and somehow my ranch remained untouched right in the middle of it. A hole in the map, an obstacle, a missing piece. "They ever try to buy this place?" I asked. Tom nodded immediately, repeatedly. "When? Before the foreclosure? After the foreclosure? During the foreclosure?" That made me sit up. They were interested even before the auction? Tom's expression darkened. "Grant, they expected to get it." Silence settled between us. Not comfortable silence, the kind that follows an important realization. Because if Cedar Ridge expected to get the ranch, then my purchase wasn't merely inconvenient. It disrupted something. Something they had already planned. Something expensive. Tom left shortly before sunset. I spent the evening installing trail cameras. 6 of them. Gate, house, barn, southern pasture, eastern fence line, northern ridge. Nothing fancy. Just enough to document whoever kept wandering onto my land. 3 nights later, one of those cameras finally paid off. At 2:07 a.m., motion triggered on the eastern ridge. I reviewed the footage over coffee the next morning. 3 men, flashlights, measuring equipment, survey rods. They weren't hunting. They weren't trespassing for fun. They were working. The camera followed them for nearly 12 minutes. Every few minutes they stopped, measured, wrote something down, then moved deeper into the ranch, toward an area almost 2 miles from the nearest Cedar Ridge property. That made no sense, until the final frame. One of the men pointed directly toward the center of my ranch. The others nodded. Then all 3 continued into the darkness. I replayed the footage 3 times. Survey crews, unauthorized stakes, contractors watching from the ridges, residents using ranch roads, photographers documenting my property. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was preparation. The question was, preparation for what? I grabbed my truck keys and headed toward the location shown in the footage. If they were measuring something, I intended to find out what. Because for the first time since arriving, I was no longer asking why Cedar Ridge wanted the ranch. I was starting to ask what they thought was already theirs. The location from the trail camera footage sat near the center of the property. No buildings, no wells, no visible improvements. Just rolling grassland crossed by an old dirt track that hadn't been maintained in years. I spent most of the morning walking the area. At first, I found nothing. Then I noticed something unusual. Several survey flags had been removed. Not naturally, deliberately. Small holes remained where markers had once stood. Someone had measured this section recently and then erased the evidence afterward. That made me stop looking at the ground and start looking at old maps. By afternoon, I was sitting in the county records office again. This time I wasn't searching current filings. I was digging into history, original plats, historic easements, boundary adjustments, anything connected to the ranch before the foreclosure. The archive room smelled like dust and paper. Most people never asked for records this old, which is why the clerk looked surprised when I requested documents dating back more than 40 years. That's going to take a while. I'll wait. 3 hours later, a woman carrying 2 storage boxes appeared beside my table. "You're Grant Mercer." I looked up. Mid-40s, professional, county identification badge, sharp eyes. "Yes." She extended her hand. "Sarah Coleman, title examiner." I shook it. She glanced at the growing stack of documents beside me. "You're looking in the right years." That got my attention immediately. "What does that mean?" Sarah pulled out a chair. "You're not the first person who's come looking for records on that ranch." I leaned back. "Cedar Ridge?" She nodded. Several times. That wasn't surprising anymore. The next part was, they always requested the same file. Which file? Instead of answering, she opened one of the storage boxes. Inside were dozens of aging property records. She carefully removed a faded packet, tied together with cloth ribbon. The cover sheet was yellow with age. The ink had nearly disappeared. Property transfer records, Mercer Ranch Holdings, 1989. My last name wasn't a coincidence. The ranch had originally belonged to a different Mercer family decades before I purchased it. Sarah slid the packet across the table. This is what they kept requesting. I opened it. Deeds, boundary surveys, tax filings, old transfer documents. Nothing remarkable, at least not initially. Then something caught my eye. A folded attachment clipped to the back. No county index stamp. No modern reference number. Almost as if nobody had reviewed it in decades. I unfolded it. 3 pages. Typed, signed, recorded. The title immediately stood out. Private Access Corridor Agreement. I looked up. Sarah was already watching my reaction. You found it. Found what? The reason they care about your ranch. I returned my attention to the document. The agreement dated back more than 30 years. Several ranch owners had signed it. A developer had signed it. County officials had witnessed it. And running through the middle of the document was a phrase that appeared over and over again. Access corridor. Access corridor. Access corridor. I pulled out a county map, then another, then another. Slowly, the pieces began fitting together. The dirt road running through my ranch. The old roadway I'd barely paid attention to. The same route connected directly to Cedar Ridge Estates. I looked back at the agreement, then at Sarah, then at the map. And suddenly I understood why she looked concerned. Wait. She nodded. I traced the route with my finger. The corridor crossed my property, continued east, connected directly to the land where Cedar Ridge now sat. My pulse accelerated. You're telling me? Keep reading. I did. And the deeper I went, the worse it became for Cedar Ridge. The agreement wasn't an easement. That distinction mattered. A lot. An easement usually runs permanently with the land. This didn't. This was something else. A conditional access license. Limited. Restricted. Revocable under specific circumstances. I reread that section twice, then a third time, because if I understood it correctly, everything changed. The HOA didn't own access through my ranch. They had permission. Permission that could be lost. Sarah finally broke the silence. Now you understand why they wanted the property before anyone else bought it. I stared at the document. The survey crews, the fake maps, the forged notices, the surveillance, the pressure. It suddenly made sense. Not because the ranch itself was valuable, because the road crossing it was. Without that corridor, Cedar Ridge's connection to the outside world became very complicated, potentially expensive, potentially catastrophic. I flipped to the final page. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A handwritten amendment attached to the original agreement. One paragraph. Just 6 lines. But 6 lines that changed everything. I read it once. Then again. Then I handed it to Sarah. You're seeing the same thing I am? She nodded slowly. Yes. The amendment listed conditions. Specific conditions. Conditions required to keep the license valid. Development limitations. Commercial restrictions. Traffic limitations. Land use restrictions. Several of them immediately sounded familiar, because Cedar Ridge had almost certainly violated every one. Sarah exhaled slowly. If that's true. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We both understood. The agreement Cedar Ridge depended on might already be void. Not recently. Years ago. Possibly before Diane Whitlock ever became HOA president. I carefully placed the document back into the folder. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Sarah looked directly at me. Grant. Yeah? You need certified copies of everything. I nodded. I was thinking the same thing. As she stood to retrieve the paperwork, I looked down at the forgotten agreement one more time. The ranch didn't own a lake. It didn't sit on oil. It didn't hide mineral wealth. It possessed something far more dangerous. The only legal route Cedar Ridge had ever relied on. And if the conditions had truly been violated, then the entire foundation of the HOA's authority might be standing on borrowed ground. I didn't tell Diane. I didn't tell Randall Pierce. And I definitely didn't tell anyone inside Cedar Ridge. The moment Sarah Coleman handed me certified copies of the corridor agreement, I understood something important. Information was leverage, and leverage only works when the other side doesn't know you have it. So I went quiet. For nearly 2 weeks, I did nothing publicly. No legal letters, no demands, no threats. I simply documented. The reaction was immediate, almost as if someone had been monitoring my next move. The first violation notice appeared 3 days later. According to Cedar Ridge, my ranch contained unauthorized fencing visible from community property. The fine was $2,500. I laughed and filed it in the binder. 2 days later came another notice. Improper land maintenance. Then another. Unsafe agricultural structures. Then another. Environmental review request. Each accusation was more ridiculous than the last. Each one went into the binder. The thicker the binder became, the more nervous Diane seemed to get. I knew because she stopped sending notices through attorneys. She started delivering them herself. One afternoon I found her standing beside my front gate, clipboard in hand, SUV idling behind her. She looked irritated before she even spoke. "You haven't responded." "To what?" "The violations." I shrugged. "I don't belong to your HOA." Her jaw tightened. "We've already established that's disputed." "No." I pointed toward the ranch. "We established you claim it." That wasn't the same thing. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Diane tried a different tactic. "The board is prepared to negotiate." Interesting. People confident in their position don't usually negotiate. About what? Community integration. I almost smiled. That was a new phrase. Last week it had been compliance. Now it was integration. Different words. Same objective. Control. "I'll think about it." She left frustrated, which was exactly where I wanted her. The next escalation happened after dark. I discovered it the following morning. Several original survey markers near the southern pasture were gone. Not damaged. Removed. Carefully. Professionally. That immediately concerned me, because those markers mattered. They established historical boundaries, property history, chain of title. Removing them didn't change ownership, but it could create confusion later. And confusion benefits people trying to rewrite history. I photographed everything: the disturbed soil, the missing markers, the tire tracks nearby. Then I called Sheriff Wade Brooks. He arrived that afternoon, late 50s, professional, quiet, the kind of sheriff who listened more than he spoke. I liked him immediately. At first, he examined the area carefully, took notes, measured distances, photographed the missing markers. Everything looked routine. Until I mentioned Cedar Ridge. The change was subtle, but noticeable. His posture stiffened. Not much. Just enough. "You think the HOA did this?" he asked. "I think somebody doesn't want accurate boundaries." That answer seemed safer. Brooks nodded slowly. Then he looked toward Cedar Ridge's distant rooftops. "Could be kids, no." I pointed toward the tracks. These came from a utility vehicle. He studied them. Didn't disagree. Didn't agree either. When he left, something bothered me. Not his investigation, his caution. Almost as if he knew the name Cedar Ridge required careful handling. I added that observation to the binder. 3 days later, Sarah called. Her voice sounded different. Urgent. "Grant, you need to come to the county office. I was there within an hour." She already had documents spread across her desk. Planning maps, engineering drawings, development overlays. Most carried confidential markings. Where did these come from? Sarah ignored the question. Instead, she pointed toward the largest map, My ranch sat directly in the center. I stared at it, then looked again. The map wasn't showing current property ownership. It showed future development. Luxury homes, private lakes, equestrian trails, club facilities, resort-style amenities, an entire expansion project, and right in the middle sat 720 acres labeled Cedar Ridge West. I felt my stomach tighten, not because of the development, because according to the map, they had already assumed ownership. Roads crossed my property, homes occupied my property, recreation areas occupied my property, everything occupied my property, without a single legal transfer. They've been showing this to investors. Sarah's voice was calm. Mine wasn't. When? For years. I looked at her. Years? She nodded. Some of these drafts are almost 4 years old. That meant something important. The HOA hadn't recently decided to acquire the ranch. The ranch had always been part of the plan. The foreclosure, the auction, the pressure campaign, the fake documents. Everything suddenly connected. Diane wasn't trying to add my ranch to Cedar Ridge. She believed it already belonged there, at least financially, maybe politically, maybe psychologically, just not legally. And that distinction was becoming dangerous for her. Sarah slid one final document across the desk. An investor presentation. Professional. Expensive. Prepared by consultants. The projected value sat near the bottom. $186 million. I stared at the number, then at the map, then back at Sarah. The ranch wasn't blocking a neighborhood expansion. It was blocking a fortune. And fortunes make people desperate. Sarah folded her hands. Grant. Yeah. I don't think they're going to stop. I looked again at the development plans built directly across land they didn't own. Then I thought about Diane. The fake notices, the surveillance, the missing survey markers, the pressure. She wasn't trying to convince me anymore. She was trying to remove an obstacle. The only question left was how far she was willing to go. Sarah answered it before I could. She handed me a newly filed court document. The plaintiff line read, Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The defendant line read, Grant Mercer. I scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. By the time I reached the signature page, I understood. Diane had stopped pretending. The HOA was suing me for ownership of the ranch. I read the complaint twice. The argument was aggressive, but simple. Cedar Ridge claimed the ranch had become functionally integrated into the community over years of use, planning, maintenance, and development reliance. According to their filing, my purchase disrupted established community interests and threatened public access. It was one of the most creative legal theories I'd ever seen, and one of the weakest. The problem wasn't the lawsuit. The problem was what it revealed. They were desperate. Confident organizations don't gamble their entire future on arguments like that. Desperate organizations do. Sarah and I spent the next week preparing, not for trial, for discovery. Because lawsuits force people to produce documents, and documents tell the truth long before witnesses do. The first breakthrough arrived from someone inside Cedar Ridge. No name, no return address. Just a large envelope delivered to my ranch mailbox. Inside were copies, meeting minutes, internal board memos, planning drafts, emails. Someone inside the HOA had decided they were tired of protecting Diane. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly midnight reviewing every page. The deeper I went, the worse it became. Cedar Ridge wasn't planning an expansion. They had been planning it for years. Every document assumed ownership of my ranch, not potential ownership, not future acquisition. Ownership One presentation labeled the property Western Access Parcel, another called it Phase 4 Development Land. My favorite simply labeled 720 acres of my ranch as Community Reserve. Not one document mentioned purchasing it. They acted as if acquisition was already guaranteed. I immediately called Sarah. She arrived the following morning. The first thing she said after reading the files was, "They sold something they didn't own." Exactly. Investors had already committed money. Developers had already drafted plans. Marketing firms had already designed brochures. Everything depended on the assumption that my ranch would eventually belong to Cedar Ridge. The question was why. The answer appeared 3 hours later, buried inside an engineering packet. The packet contained roadway projections, utility routing studies, emergency response maps, traffic flow reports. The entire western expansion depended on one thing: the corridor. Every major road entered through it. Every utility crossed it. Every emergency route used it. Every future phase relied on it. Without access through my ranch, the expansion became impossible. Not difficult. Impossible. I leaned back in my chair. Finally, everything fit. The fake notices, the surveillance, the pressure campaign, the lawsuit. The ranch itself wasn't the prize. Control was, and the corridor controlled everything. Sarah pointed toward one highlighted section. "Look at this." I did. A cost estimate. Alternative access construction. Projected price, $42.7 million. I stared at the number. That's what it would cost if they lost corridor access? Sarah nodded. At minimum. Now I understood the panic. Cedar Ridge wasn't protecting a development. They were protecting tens of millions of dollars. Maybe more. The anonymous envelope wasn't finished helping us. A second packet sat at the bottom. Board communications, private emails, most were routine. Then I found one that wasn't. Subject line: Auction Contingency Plan. My pulse immediately accelerated. The message was nearly 4 years old, sent before the foreclosure auction, months before I ever heard of the ranch. The sender wasn't Diane, but she was copied. So was Randall Pierce. So were several board members. The final paragraph stopped me cold. If the parcel enters public auction, acquisition must be completed before independent bidders become aware of corridor implications. I read it again. Then a third time. Independent bidders. They knew. Years before I arrived, they already understood the danger. Someone had been preparing to secure the ranch before outsiders could discover what it controlled. And somehow, despite all those plans, they failed. I remembered Diane's comment at the gate. Everyone expected the auction to go differently. At the time, it sounded strange. Now it sounded like a confession. That afternoon, Tom Grayson stopped by unexpectedly. I showed him part of the development map. His reaction told me everything. "You've got to be kidding." No. Tom studied the map again, then pointed toward the western section. My cousin used to own land there. I looked up. What happened? Cedar Ridge bought him out. Fair price? Tom laughed. Not even close. Then he pointed toward another section. Same thing happened there. And another. And another. Every major expansion zone had followed the same pattern. Pressure, negotiation, acquisition, development. The ranch was simply the first property that hadn't cooperated, the first obstacle they couldn't remove. By evening, my legal team had grown. Not attorneys, witnesses, Sarah, Tom, records, maps, emails, planning files. evidence. The lawsuit had forced Cedar Ridge into the open, and every day they stayed in court, they produced more documents, more assumptions, more admissions, more mistakes. Then Diane made the biggest mistake yet. 2 weeks after filing suit, she approved investor presentations for the next expansion phase. Those presentations became public. Sarah obtained copies within 24 hours. I unfolded the map and immediately saw the problem. The presentations still showed my ranch as HOA property, not proposed acquisition, not disputed ownership, already owned, already incorporated, already developed. The lawsuit wasn't even halfway through preliminary hearings, yet they were presenting my land to investors as if the court had already ruled. That document went straight into evidence. 3 days later, another filing arrived. This one carried Diane Whitlock's signature. She wasn't asking for negotiation. She wasn't asking for access. She wasn't asking for settlement. She wanted the judge to award Cedar Ridge ownership of the ranch outright. I stared at the filing for several seconds. Then I smiled. Because for the first time since this started, I realized something important. Diane wasn't filing from a position of strength. She was filing from fear. And fearful people make mistakes. The courtroom would be the first place she couldn't control. And sooner or later, someone was going to be forced to read the very document she had spent years trying to bury. The first hearing drew far more people than I expected. Investors filled several rows. Cedar Ridge residents occupied nearly every available seat. Reporters lined the back wall. Word had spread. When tens of millions of dollars depend on one piece of land, people pay attention. I arrived early with Sarah Coleman. 2 bankers' boxes sat beside our table. Certified records, county plats, survey maps, the corridor agreement. Everything Cedar Ridge hoped nobody would see. Across the aisle, Diane Whitlock looked confident. Too confident. She sat beside Randall Pierce, speaking quietly while occasionally glancing toward the gallery. Several investors greeted her before court began. That told me something. She was still selling certainty, even now, even after discovery, even after the leaked documents. She believed she could win, or at least convince everyone else she could. The judge entered exactly at 9. Judge Eleanor Hastings. No nonsense, no patience for theatrics. The kind of judge attorneys either respected or feared, sometimes both. The hearing began with Randall. For nearly 40 minutes, he presented Cedar Ridge's position. The argument sounded polished. Years of hours of community reliance, historical usage, infrastructure investment, public necessity, economic impact. He spoke as though the ranch already belonged to the HOA and the court simply needed to formalize reality. Several investors nodded along. A few residents seemed convinced. That was Randall's strength. Confidence. He made weak arguments sound reasonable. Then he made his mistake. He talked too much. Because the longer he spoke, the more obvious something became. He never mentioned ownership. Not real ownership. Not once. He discussed expectations, assumptions, planning, reliance, everything except title, everything except the deed. Eventually, Judge Hastings interrupted him. Counselor. Randall stopped. Yes, Your Honor? I've heard extensive discussion about community reliance. She adjusted her glasses. What I have not heard is a clear explanation of ownership. The room became quieter. Randall recovered quickly. The issue is more complex than ownership alone. The judge looked unimpressed. Property law generally disagrees. Several people in the gallery laughed. Not many. Just enough. Diane's expression tightened. Randall immediately shifted topics. Unfortunately for him, Sarah was waiting. When our turn arrived, She stood. No dramatic speech, no theatrics, just documents, one after another. County plats, historical filings, certified ownership records, transfer documents, the foundation, the facts. The judge reviewed each carefully. Randall objected repeatedly. Most objections failed, because certified records don't care about opinions. Then Sarah introduced the investor presentations, the leaked development maps, the emails, the internal planning documents. One exhibit after another appeared on the courtroom screens, each showing my ranch labeled as HOA property years before any legal ownership existed. I watched several investors exchange uncomfortable looks. The mood in the room shifted, slightly, but noticeably. Then Sarah introduced the auction contingency email, the one discussing independent bidders, the one proving Cedar Ridge knew exactly what was at stake. The judge spent nearly 5 minutes reading it. When she finally looked up, she focused directly on Diane. Not Randall. Diane. That wasn't a good sign. For anyone. Then Sarah sat down, and the courtroom became still, because everyone knew what remained. The corridor agreement. The document at the center of everything. The document Cedar Ridge had spent years avoiding. The document nobody wanted discussed publicly. Sarah handed a certified copy to the judge, another to Randall, another to the court clerk. Then she sat quietly. No speech, no explanation, nothing. Judge Hastings examined the cover page, then flipped through several sections. Her expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The way experienced people react when they discover a detail nobody expected. Finally, she looked toward Randall. Counselor. Yes, Your Honor. I would like the court record to include the relevant corridor agreement language. Randall nodded. Of course. The judge handed him the document. Please read it. For the first time all morning, uncertainty crossed his face. Only for a second. But I saw it. So did Sarah. So did Diane. Randall cleared his throat, adjusted the papers, then began reading aloud. The first page sounded harmless. Historical access rights, license provisions, development references. Nothing dramatic. Several people in the gallery relaxed. Then he reached the conditions section. I watched him slow down, just slightly. His voice lost some confidence. He continued reading. Traffic restrictions, commercial limitations, expansion limitations, land use limitations. Each condition sounded increasingly familiar, because Cedar Ridge had violated all of them, years ago. The room grew quieter with every paragraph. Investors stopped taking notes. Residents leaned forward. Even Diane stopped looking comfortable. Then Randall reached the amendment. The handwritten amendment attached decades earlier. The one Sarah and I had discovered. He began reading it aloud. Halfway through the paragraph, he stopped. Completely. Silence. The kind of silence people remember. Judge Hastings looked up. Counselor? Randall didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the page. The courtroom waited. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, the judge repeated herself. Mr. Pierce? Slowly, Randall looked up, and for the first time since this case began, he looked like a man who had just discovered he was standing on the wrong side of his own argument. The courtroom remained silent. Judge Hastings waited. So did everyone else. Finally, Randall cleared his throat. Your Honor. Then he stopped. Not because he lacked words, because the words on the page were impossible to explain. The judge extended her hand. Give me the document. Randall hesitated, only briefly. Then he handed it over. Judge Hastings read the amendment herself. 1 page, 6 lines, 30 years old, powerful enough to derail an entire development. When she finished, she looked directly at Diane Whitlock. Not at her attorney, not at the investors. At Diane. Mrs. Whitlock, were you aware of this provision? Diane immediately looked toward Randall. A mistake. The judge noticed. Everyone noticed. I'll take that as a yes. The room shifted. You could feel it. Not physically, but emotionally. For months, maybe years, Cedar Ridge had acted like the strongest party in every room. That strength was evaporating. The amendment was simple. If the community expanded beyond specific development limits, without obtaining written approval from the corridor owner, the access license became subject to immediate review and termination. Not suspension, not renegotiation. Review and termination. The difference mattered. A lot. Judge Hastings turned another page, then another. The courtroom listened as she summarized the conditions allowed. Commercial development restrictions, traffic limitations, infrastructure expansion limits, population thresholds. Every single category appeared tied to maintaining the corridor license. Every single category appeared to have been exceeded years earlier. The investors looked uncomfortable now. Several began whispering among themselves. One man opened a folder and started reviewing maps. Another pulled out his phone. Across the room, Cedar Ridge residents exchanged confused looks, because for the first time they were hearing information their board had never shared. Judge Hastings looked back at Randall. How many of these conditions remain in compliance today? Randall didn't answer immediately, because there wasn't a good answer. Everyone knew it. Finally, he said, "We would need additional review." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You filed a lawsuit seeking ownership of 720 acres. Yes. And you didn't review the conditions governing the access corridor?" Silence, again. Longer this time. The kind that hurts. The kind attorneys fear. I glanced toward Sarah. She didn't smile. She didn't react at all. She simply kept taking notes. Facts don't need celebration. Facts win by existing. The judge requested a brief recess. Nobody left the courtroom immediately. Most people remained seated, stunned. The atmosphere had changed completely. Before the hearing, Cedar Ridge looked powerful. Now they looked exposed. I watched several investors approach Randall. The conversations looked tense, very tense. One man pointed directly at the corridor agreement. Another shook his head repeatedly. Diane spent most of the recess making phone calls. Whatever confidence she'd carried into court was gone. When proceedings resumed, Judge Hastings had questions. Lots of them. Not for me. For Cedar Ridge. Questions about permits. Questions about expansion phases. Questions about infrastructure. Questions about population growth. Questions about commercial developments. The more questions she asked, the clearer the problem became. Nobody had monitored compliance with the agreement. Nobody had reviewed the restrictions. Nobody had disclosed the risks. Or worse, someone had, and ignored them. Sarah introduced additional exhibits: development approvals, construction permits, board minutes, planning maps. Each one pushed Cedar Ridge further beyond the agreement's limits. Then came the final blow, a county planning map from 6 years earlier, officially approved, officially recorded, officially signed. It showed Cedar Ridge's expansion crossing every threshold listed in the amendment. The date mattered, because it meant the potential violation wasn't recent. It wasn't new. It had existed for years. Judge Hastings stared at the map, then at Diane, then at Randall. Neither looked eager to speak. Finally, the judge closed the file. I am ordering an immediate review of every permit, expansion approval, and infrastructure authorization connected to Cedar Ridge Estates. The room erupted. Not loudly, but suddenly. Investors started talking. Residents looked alarmed. Reporters began writing furiously. Court officers immediately called for order. The judge wasn't finished. Until that review is complete, the court will not consider any ownership transfer claims involving the Mercer Ranch. That was devastating, because ownership was the entire purpose of the lawsuit. Without it, Cedar Ridge had no leverage, no victory, no immediate path forward. The hearing ended shortly afterward. As people filed out, I remained seated, watching, listening, observing. Across the room, Diane Whitlock stood frozen beside her attorney. The woman who had arrived at my gate claiming ownership now looked like someone discovering she might not even control the road leading to her own neighborhood. Sarah gathered her files. You realize what happens next? I nodded. Investigation. Exactly. She looked toward the departing investors. And if the review finds what we think it finds. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Because we both understood. The lawsuit was no longer the biggest threat facing Cedar Ridge. The truth was, and once investigators started examining years of permits, maps, approvals, and board decisions, the question would no longer be whether Cedar Ridge could take my ranch. The question would become whether Cedar Ridge had ever possessed the rights it claimed in the first place. The answer arrived faster than anyone expected. 3 weeks after the hearing, the county review team released its preliminary findings. The first report was only 18 pages long. It hit Cedar Ridge like a tornado. Sarah called me before I even saw the document. They found it. What? The first violation date. I drove into town immediately. When I arrived, she already had the report spread across her desk. One section was highlighted. Expansion Permit, Phase 2. Approved 6 years earlier. The same expansion that pushed Cedar Ridge beyond the population and traffic limitations listed in the corridor agreement. The date mattered, because it established something critical. The access license hadn't become questionable recently. It had become questionable 6 years ago. Everything approved afterward rested on a foundation that might no longer exist. I sat back in my chair. That means every later expansion depended on rights they may not have had. Sarah nodded. Exactly. And once government agencies start using words like may not have had, lenders start getting nervous. Very nervous. The first lender froze financing 48 hours later. Then another. Then another. Construction stopped on 3 separate projects before the end of the week. Workers disappeared. Equipment sat idle. Sales offices reduced operating hours. For the first time since I arrived, Cedar Ridge looked uncertain. Then the investors started asking questions. Questions Diane Whitlock couldn't answer. Questions Randall Pierce couldn't answer. Questions nobody on the HOA board wanted to answer. Why wasn't the corridor agreement disclosed? When did the board learn about the restrictions? Who approved expansion plans after the violation threshold? And the most dangerous question of all, who knew first? The answers weren't pretty. Internal board emails surfaced during discovery. Additional meeting minutes appeared. More documents arrived anonymously. Apparently, once people realize a ship might be sinking, they become much more willing to share information. One email became the center of attention. It was written almost 5 years earlier. Diane had received it directly from a consulting attorney. The message was short, professional, and devastating. The attorney warned that continued expansion could trigger review provisions within the corridor agreement. The warning wasn't vague. It wasn't hidden. It was explicit. Someone had identified the risk years ago. The board had been told, and the board had continued expanding anyway. That email changed everything, because now this wasn't merely oversight. It looked deliberate. The next resignation came 2 days later, then another, then another. 3 board members stepped down within a single week. Publicly, they cited personal reasons. Privately, everyone knew why. Nobody wanted to be the last person standing beside Diane Whitlock. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page: Cedar Ridge access rights under review. The article spread quickly. Residents started showing up at HOA meetings, not to support the board, to demand answers. Tom Grayson attended one. He called me afterward. "You should have seen it. What happened?" "People are furious." That didn't surprise me. Most homeowners weren't developers. They weren't investors. They simply bought houses. Now they were discovering that years of expansion plans relied on legal assumptions that might never have existed. The anger was growing. And it wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at the people who had promised certainty. Meanwhile, the lawsuit that started everything was quietly falling apart. Randall Pierce requested extensions, then more extensions, then procedural delays. The confidence he'd shown during the early hearings was gone, because every new document pushed Cedar Ridge further into a corner. Then came the report that changed the entire balance of power. County transportation officials released an infrastructure review. The conclusion appeared on page 4. I read it 3 times, not because it was complicated, because it was extraordinary. According to the review, nearly every major road entering Cedar Ridge crossed corridor rights tied to my ranch. Emergency access, utility access, future development access. Everything depended on the same agreement. The same agreement Cedar Ridge had ignored. The same agreement Diane had tried to bury. Sarah looked up from the report. They never owned the roads. I nodded slowly. They just assumed they did. That distinction became the story. Reporters picked it up immediately. Residents repeated it. Investors feared it. The HOA never owned the roads. They were operating on permission. Permission granted by a document they stopped respecting years ago. The following week, I received a phone call from Randall Pierce, the first direct call he'd made to me since the lawsuit began. His tone sounded completely different. Measured, careful, almost polite. "We'd like to discuss potential resolutions." I almost laughed. A few months earlier, they wanted ownership of my ranch. Now they wanted a conversation. "Who is we?" A brief pause. "The association." Interesting. Not Diane. Not Cedar Ridge leadership. The association. Even Randall was distancing himself. We agreed to meet. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. They wanted certainty. They wanted stability. Most of all, they wanted access. The one thing they suddenly realized they could not take. When the meeting ended, Randall remained seated for several seconds. Finally, he looked at me. "Did you know this would happen?" I thought about that. The gate, the fake notices, the lawsuit, the corridor agreement, the hearing, the silence. Then I shook my head. No. He looked surprised. "What did you know?" I stood up. That eventually someone would read the deed. By the time I left, the power dynamic had completely reversed. The same people who threatened me with lawsuits now needed cooperation. The same HOA that claimed ownership now depended on permission. And throughout Cedar Ridge, one question was becoming impossible to ignore. If the HOA never owned the roads they controlled, what else had they been wrong about? The answer was coming, and Diane Whitlock was running out of places to hide from it. The final hearing took place nearly 4 months after Cedar Ridge filed the lawsuit. By then, the case barely resembled the one Diane had started. Originally, the HOA wanted ownership of my ranch. Now they were fighting to explain years of decisions built on rights they never fully possessed. The courtroom was packed again. Only the mood had changed. The investors who once sat beside Diane now sat several rows away. Former board members avoided eye contact. Residents filled nearly every seat. Many of them weren't there to support the HOA. They were there to find out what had actually happened. Judge Hastings entered and immediately got to work. No speeches, no drama, just findings. The county review was complete. The infrastructure review was complete. The permit review was complete. And every report pointed in the same direction. The corridor agreement governed access. The corridor agreement imposed conditions. Those conditions had been violated years earlier. Expansion after expansion had proceeded anyway. The judge summarized the findings calmly, yet every sentence seemed heavier than the last. By the time she finished, nobody in the room looked surprised anymore, only exhausted. Then came the ruling. The HOA's ownership claim was denied in full. Every argument Cedar Ridge presented failed. Reliance wasn't ownership. Planning wasn't ownership. Assumptions weren't ownership. The deed controlled. The corridor agreement controlled. The records controlled. Facts won. The ranch remained exactly what it had always been. Mine. I looked toward Diane. For the first time since I met her, she didn't appear angry. She looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from defending a story long after the evidence stops cooperating. Judge Hastings wasn't finished. The court also recognized that the access corridor remained tied to the original agreement and its conditions. That meant Cedar Ridge's future access rights would require formal resolution. Not through assumptions, not through pressure, not through HOA notices, through law. Exactly where this dispute should have started. The hearing ended shortly afterward. Reporters rushed outside. Residents gathered in small groups. Investors disappeared quickly. Most of them had already seen this coming. I stepped into the hallway carrying the same binder that had started with fake notices and forged maps. Only now it contained court rulings, certified findings, proof. Sarah Coleman joined me near the courthouse entrance. "You realize they're going to call. They already have." She laughed. "Not Randall." I knew what she meant. The homeowners. And she was right. The calls started that afternoon. Not from board members. Not from attorneys. From residents, retirees, families, veterans. People who bought homes without ever seeing the corridor agreement. People who genuinely believed the HOA owned what it claimed to own. Most asked the same question. What happens now? It was a fair question, and honestly, I had been thinking about it for weeks. A month later, we held a public meeting, not at Cedar Ridge, at the ranch. More than 100 people showed up. Some arrived nervous, others defensive. Most simply looked worried. They weren't concerned about HOA politics anymore. They were concerned about access, about getting home, about emergency services, about the future. I stood in front of the old barn and laid everything out. The court ruling, the corridor agreement, the review findings. No surprises, no hidden clauses, no tricks. Just facts. Then I gave them an offer, a permanent access agreement, directly between the corridor owner and the residents. Transparent, recorded, legally enforceable. No hidden authority, no private control. No special privileges. $1 per household per year, enough to maintain the paperwork. Nothing more. The crowd became quiet. Then someone asked the question everyone expected. What do you want in return? I looked across the group, at the families, the retirees, the people who never benefited from the deception. Then I answered honestly. The HOA dissolves. Silence. A different kind this time. Not fear, relief, because many of them wanted the same thing. The following months moved quickly. The board collapsed. Several remaining members resigned. The association voted to dissolve. The gates came down. The private enforcement rules disappeared. The signs disappeared. The patrol vehicles disappeared. And slowly, Cedar Ridge stopped acting like a kingdom. It became what it should have been from the beginning. A neighborhood. Nothing more. 6 months later, I stood beside a restored boundary marker near the entrance to the ranch. The same entrance where Diane had greeted me with fake notices and impossible claims. The iron HOA gate was gone. The corridor remained open. Legally, properly, the way it always should have been. Tom Grayson pulled up beside me that evening. He looked at the marker, then at the road, then at me. Funny how all this started. I smiled. With a gate? No. He shook his head. With people thinking nobody would read the paperwork. That was probably true. Most of the conflict could have been avoided if someone had simply respected the documents already sitting in the county archives. The deed, the agreement, the conditions. The truth had existed the entire time. It wasn't hidden. It was ignored. The sun settled behind the Wyoming hills as Tom drove away. I remained there a little longer, looking across 720 acres of open land. The ranch hadn't changed ownership. The corridor hadn't changed ownership. The documents hadn't changed. Only the story people told themselves about them. And eventually, stories lose. Records don't. Because they spent years acting like they owned the way home. Then their lawyers finally read the deed.
If there's one lesson in this story, it's that the truth doesn't become less true just because people ignore it. That corridor agreement sat in county records for decades. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't lost. People simply stopped paying attention to it because they assumed the future would work out the way they wanted. But assumptions aren't ownership, and plans aren't fast. In the end, what mattered wasn't who spoke the loudest or who had the biggest development plans. What mattered was taking the time to understand what was actually written down and respecting the agreement that came before us. There's something reassuring about that. In a world where people often rush to conclusions, the truth has a way of waiting patiently. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes years, but once it begs the real records on the words and steady persistent, it eventually finds its way into the light. Now, I'd love to hear from you. If you were in Rand's position, would you have kept fighting for the truth, or would you have taken the easier path and walked away? From a 1 if you stand your ground, and from a 0 if you move on. And if you ever deal with the HOAs of property dispute or a situation where paperwork told a very different story than people did, share it in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people standing firm, protecting what's there, and letting the facts speak for themselves, consider subscribing. There are plenty more stories of quiet courage, perseverance, and justice still ahead.